welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Alabama state legislators are facing a special session to pass a budget for the state's general fund, which faces perhaps a $200 million gap for the upcoming year. Lawmakers are required to pass a balanced budget, but seem unable to agree on whether we should cut taxes or raise taxes or cut spending. How might these decisions affect the prospects for a prosperous future for our state? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss these important matters is Dr. Stephen Miller, the new Executive Director of the Johnson Center, who has come to Troy from Western Carolina University. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here.
Now, before we get into talk about the state budget, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? You've come from Western Carolina, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, so I guess my career and ideas originated as an undergraduate student. I had a great professor, actually a few great professors as an undergraduate. I basically had the experience that we are replicating here at the Johnson Center and as we would like to see at so many more universities where students are exposed to a good solid education in principled free market economics. That was at Towson University in Maryland, just outside of Baltimore.
Okay.
From there, I actually went to work at the Cato Institute for a little while, and then I went to graduate school at George Mason University.
Okay.
Where I got my doctorate, and then I went straight from there to Western Carolina University, where I've been a professor there for almost a decade.
Well, again, we're happy to have you here, and welcome to Troy, and hope you get adjusted quickly to Alabama, and we can do a lot of great stuff here at the Johnson Center. Well, you've come into Troy and Alabama, interesting times where we have this special session of the legislature, which I guess technically is underway right now, but is going to get reconvened soon.
Yes.
To discuss the situation with our budget gap. We talk about the budget being in a gap, but it's only this general fund budget that is facing a gap. Tell us a little bit about the two different budgets that our state has and what sort of why we have these budgets and what the situation we face is.
Yes, there are two main funds that the state uses, both in terms of collecting tax revenue and other sources of revenue and for expenditures. Now, there are other smaller funds, but the bulk of state revenues and state spending go to either the Education Trust Fund or to the General Fund. Now, the Education Trust Fund, it turns out, is the bulk of spending. It's the bulk of spending, and it's the bulk of tax revenue. It includes the income tax and the sales tax revenue. Those are actually set aside to go to the Education Trust Fund. What the Education Trust Fund spends on is almost self-evident, right? It's educational expenses. Now, that includes K through 12 education. That includes public universities that receive support from the state, including Troy University, the University of Alabama, etc. That's all part of it, but it also includes funding for the arts, many things that would broadly be construed as educational efforts. That goes to the Education Fund. The General Fund is only about 20% of overall state spending, and they have to get their tax revenue from much smaller sources. I was looking on the state budget webpage last week and found that there are over 40 different sources of revenue for the general fund, and most of them are fairly small. The largest ones are things like the tobacco taxes and revenues from ABC sales and things like that. So these are small sources of revenue that put together are used to fund fairly large things in the state budget. The two largest expenses.
So this is
we have up
just
here.
Our revenue overall.
Okay.
It does show individual income is big, and then I guess sales is down here as the next biggest source, but then the others, the pink there is the other taxes, but
right.
As a whole they're pretty large, but I guess as you mentioned, every one of them individually is pretty small.
Right.
And so then you talk about on the education side what we're spending money on. What are we spending money on out of the general fund?
We're spending money primarily on two things. The biggest portion would be Medicaid, and this is the state portion of Medicaid. So there's a separate fund set aside where the federal funds flow in and cover the federal side of the expenses for Medicaid. But just Alabama's own expenses for Medicaid, that's the biggest part of the general fund. And then the second largest is corrections, the Department of Corrections.
And so when we're talking about trying to adjust spending or control spending on the general fund, these are our two largest components, right?
Yes.
And as you mentioned, the budget ends up being quite complicated because you have a bunch of federal dollars that are coming in with this. I mean, most of our spending on Medicaid are actually federal dollars that are coming into the state and then being spent, right?
That's right. And in many ways, in many states, I've noticed, they just tend not to count the federal side of Medicaid, or they tend not to count federal transfers or all kinds of federally supported programs. That would also include Medicare and CHIP and things like that. That when it comes to the federal side of expenses, they kind of separate that from the rest of the state budgets. So both the expenditures and the revenues from the federal government, they kind of set aside, and they talk more about their own revenue sources and how they expend things from their own revenue sources.
So certain of our taxes go into the general fund, certain of our taxes go into the educational fund. Now, a lot of times, like in our household at home, you can keep some separate account for maybe a child's finances or whatever, but it's all really basically coming out of the same pot. So to some extent, some of our viewers might think like, oh yeah, on paper we have this educational trust fund and the general fund. Are they all just one big pot for the state?
Well, no, because the legislature and the governor are actually very constrained right now through the earmarking. They are, the way the law is written is they are only supposed to be using the revenue sources for the education trust fund for expenses in the education trust fund, and the same thing with the general fund. What may be flexible is what counts as education spending, right, or what counts as general fund spending. That over time those things could be reclassified, but in any given year there's a bit of a constraint there that the legislature and the governor, the administration, runs up against.
So this is a meaningful distinction here, right? So this is constraining their behaviors in some ways.
Well, it's meaningful enough, Dan, that they are having the special session to figure out how to cover the gap in the general fund. Well, it turns out that there is a surplus in the education trust fund that's roughly the same amount. Both are right now estimated to be around $280 million. The numbers vary. I've heard one where it's 290 as a shortfall or a gap in the general fund, and just 10 million fewer, 280 as a surplus in the education trust fund. This isn't completely determined yet, but those are roughly equal. So if they did have free rein to kind of move money around however they wanted, they'd probably just solve the problem that way.
Okay, so we have these two budgets, and Governor Bentley has mentioned how the general fund is just not in a very healthy situation because not only do we have a shortfall this year, but the shortfalls, these gaps, are expected to continue over time. So this isn't just like a one-year issue here. If we look at our taxes over time, when we look at what's happened to the growth in taxes over time, there's a story behind this, right? There's not an accident here, right?
Right. And so what you see in this slide is that the revenue sources for the education trust fund have been growing over time. So income tax revenue and corporate income tax and the sales tax revenue, especially the sales tax and the individual income tax, those are the largest sources of tax revenue. They have been growing over time. But the kinds of revenue sources that go to the general fund have not been growing over time, and some have even seen some decline. And those expenses, corrections and Medicaid, those are programs and those are areas of spending where the costs have gone up.
And certainly Medicaid's been one, even with the federal dollars coming in, or maybe because of the federal dollars coming in, that it's not just Alabama. Lots of states have seen Medicaid expand to be a budget breaker or the dominant factor in state budgeting, right?
Yes. So one figure is that between 2000 and 2010, state spending on Medicaid in Alabama has gone up by almost 80%. That's from 2000 to 2010. If you were to get current figures, my guess is it would have roughly doubled over the past 15 years. And that's a very rapid rate of growth in terms of Medicaid spending going up at the state level. And it's gone up without real benefits for the poor. The University of Virginia study there was a University of Virginia study that recently showed that Medicaid patients, actually if you compare people with similar health characteristics, that people who are insured by Medicaid were actually 14% more likely to die after surgical procedures than people who had no insurance at all. That's very concerning given how fast the costs have gone up.
Yeah, I mean, that is a fascinating whole issue. I mean, because we spend so much money on Medicaid, and yet, furthermore, many patients with Medicaid have a hard time finding a doctor to take, who will take their coverages because the doctors don't get reimbursed at a very good rate. So I mean, yeah, that's a particularly troubling, I think. So I guess one way to think of it, if we look at this problem, what we've had is we haven't had the right where we've had an imbalance in terms of which taxes are assigned to the general fund versus the educational trust fund. And in particular, with all the taxes that have been increasing over time, they're tied to the educational trust fund, and none of the ones the ones tied to the general fund aren't increasing, right?
That's correct.
So one solution might be, could we just reallocate some of these taxes from the education trust fund to the general fund?
That would certainly be something that could patch the problem in the short term. However, probably the bigger problem with the general fund is it's not just seeing declining or flat revenue sources, it's seeing very steady increases in spending in those areas. And so for long-term solvency, what you'd really want to see there is a way to control those costs, at least prevent them from rising, and if possible, bring them down.
Now, I think we used the term earmarking because I guess when economists or state budget experts would describe what's going on here, what we will call certain taxes here in Alabama are earmarked to the educational trust fund. Now, Alabama stands out compared to other states in our use of earmarking of our tax dollars, right?
Yes, very much. I would say it's the most earmarked state there is, and this bar graph kind of indicates that the U.S. average is to have a relatively small portion of state spending. In most states, it's a relatively small portion that is earmarked, but in Alabama, it's the vast majority of both tax revenue and other sources of revenue are earmarked in some particular way, and that is unusual to Alabama, that spending is constrained in terms of where exactly it goes.
Is there any reason that economists would offer as to why it would make sense for voters to want to have their tax dollars earmarked like this?
There is a very good political economy reason. I think I'd argue, and I think a number of other Virginia school political economists would agree, that one thing that's appealing about earmarking is that it does serve as a constraint, that when legislators in particular, or a governor, are free to allocate spending however they see, then whenever a revenue source grows rapidly, it allows them to kind of increase spending in ways that aren't necessarily efficient or are towards providing the public good. When that happens, you would see spending on pet projects, that spending becomes a political rather than an economic endeavor.
Well, and I think Alabama's general or educational trust fund budget goes back to the 1930s at a point in time when I think people recognized that our state lawmakers weren't putting enough dollars into education and wanted to try to force them to do that, right? And so that would be the kind of thing you're in effect trying to force or tie the legislators' hands and say, we want you to spend, not just collect our tax dollars, but we really want you to spend it on this.
Right, I think so.
And so some people have suggested that perhaps what we could do is just combine the general and education budgets in this fashion. And if we think of it in terms of earmarking, that would sort of be a suggestion to go away from earmarking altogether, right? Would that be
effectively, that would be taking away most of the most constraining form of earmarking in the state.
Do you think that would be a wise thing to try and do, to take away some of the restraints on politicians in this regard?
I think the obvious result of that would be a continued increase on things like Medicaid and corrections, possibly at the expense of things that are currently funded out of the Education Trust Fund. And that could include higher ed, that could include K through 12, but anything funded out of there, out of the Education Trust Fund, one that's currently funded that way, would be on the table to receive less and less as the expenses, particularly in Medicare and corrections, continue to rise.
Well, Alabama legislators are, unlike their colleagues in Washington, actually are going to have to pass a balanced budget, right?
Yes.
We face a balanced budget constraint here in Alabama, right?
That's correct. And in Alabama, it's a fairly strict one.
And so if we don't have enough money to cover the expenditures as they are now, either spending's going to have to be cut or taxes are going to be raised, or maybe some combination of the two, right?
That's correct. Now, my understanding is that it has happened in the past, and it could happen as an emergency. As an emergency measure, they could effectively take some of the extra revenue from the Education Trust Fund and use it to patch the gap, but they could not systematically make that change without a major overhaul of the current funding.
Well, Governor Bentley proposed a set of tax increases during the regular session, and they essentially went nowhere. So it seems like traditional tax increases may not be in the cards. One of the things that people have pointed to that we might want to turn to try to raise some more revenue could be either a state lottery or casino gambling. How could these actually serve to help the state's financing?
Well, if those revenues were earmarked to the general fund, they could help considerably in the short term. As a matter of fact, it's potentially, if we were to talk about all forms of gambling, including a lottery, including slot machines, including full service casinos, those could potentially provide a big amount of revenue, perhaps enough to fill the current funding, or it certainly wouldn't happen over the next few months, right? But it could certainly be enough to patch future funding gaps for the next few years. But there is a ceiling on what those revenues can be, and it doesn't address the deeper problem of rising costs, both in terms of Medicare and corrections, especially.
And at some level, there's a lot of evidence that economists have assembled that people in states without lotteries do cross the border and buy lottery tickets in other states, and certainly many people here in Alabama head off to Biloxi or Gulfport to gamble in the casinos there. So I mean, some people would say, like, well, look, we're already in effect paying taxes, but we're paying taxes through the lotteries in Georgia or Florida, and the taxes we end up spending on these cases go to Mississippi or Georgia. Wouldn't it make sense for our state to have these gambling, casino gambling, or a state lottery, and try to keep those dollars from going elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that, right, these are potentially strong sources of revenue. It's my only response is that there's a limit on how much they can grow, whereas there does not appear to be a limit on how high the costs of Medicare, for example, can grow.
Now, we've talked about if we're not going to turn to traditional tax increases, and we may or may not want to turn to casino gambling, because even if the legislature wanted to try to turn to casino gambling, it would have to go before the voters, right?
That's correct. And if it went to voters, it's really hard to say what would happen.
And even in that case, I mean, you couldn't, when this special session meets, they wouldn't know for sure if it's going to pass or not, or whether there'd be any revenues for the next fiscal year from, say, a state lottery, right?
Right. It wouldn't do anything about this year's gap in the general fund, and it wouldn't, and it may fail, in which case it's funny. It's a bit of a gamble as to whether or not that would work. But it certainly is something that could happen, and that could be an extra source of revenue for a struggling general fund. But it does not really address that long-term problem of rising costs.
Now, some people would say if we're not going to seek to augment revenue somehow, and we're going to try to cut funding, I mean, some people would argue that Alabama already has a pretty low level of state and local government spending if you compare us to other states around here. Our state teachers in the state haven't gotten much in the way of raises since before the last recession. A lot of times they have to pay for a good amount of the school supplies that they use out of their own pocket. So, I mean, many people might look at this and say, well, look, our state government services are already pretty poorly funded. Could we really afford to cut spending any further without causing real and significant harm?
There are actually ways that spending could be cut without causing significant harm, and one of those ways would be something that our colleague Dan Smith has done a study on, which
Let's see.
We'll cut back on that.
Okay. We'll come back to Dan's.
Yeah, I'll come back to Dan's study later.
It's one of the things we do spend a lot of money on is corrections, right? And so that might be one area we could look to start to turn to make some changes in the longer term, right?
And this would be a long-term project, right? Mm-hmm. This would not solve the general fund gap immediately. It would take several years for this to happen. But if you had significant criminal justice reform of the type that was aimed fundamentally at reducing the number of people in prison. So right now, people talk about the U.S. prison system being very overloaded. However, if you look at this chart, the U.S. average is 707 persons incarcerated for every 100,000 people. Now, this is very high globally. It's extremely high compared to other highly advanced economies in the world. But you see the top 4 states are Louisiana, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Alabama. Alabama has the 4th highest incarceration rate in the U.S., and in the U.S. it's already a very high incarceration rate. Now, what do I mean by criminal justice reform? Well, I mean the kind of reforms that look fundamentally at what it takes to rehabilitate people who are currently in the criminal justice system. Is prison necessary? Are long sentences necessary? Are mandatory minimum sentences necessary? Or should there be a closer look at making punishments fit crimes so that you don't have such an overloaded prison system? Because it probably doesn't do much for the nonviolent criminal to to have an extended stay in our current prison system, especially as crowded as they are. That makes the experience even less likely to be rehabilitative.
And not only might they sometimes people talk about a nonviolent criminal going to prison and then they really learn a lot of criminal skills while they're in prison. But furthermore, I mean, the people who go to prison for nonviolent offenses then have that prison record on, and it's hard for them to contribute fully as productive members of society afterwards, right?
Right. It greatly harms their prospects and their economic opportunity going forward. It has changed. There have been some large corporations that still do a criminal background investigation, but no longer make employees ineligible for employment based on a criminal history. But most large employers still do this and still essentially are blackballing any workers who have a criminal record. And sometimes it can be a very modest thing on the criminal record, low level drug possession when someone was much younger, for example. And I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying that's a mistake that can harm someone's economic opportunity for a very long time.
So we could certainly reduce our prison size here and not necessarily have to release a lot of the violent offenders back into our society.
Yes, I'm definitely not in favor of that. If you look at the trends in the increase in U.S. incarceration over the past 40 years or so, the vast majority of that growth is in nonviolent offenders. And this makes sense because violent crime is actually something that's been declining very steadily since the early 1990s. There have been very, very significant, very steady decreases in violent crime across the U.S., and it includes Alabama. So it hasn't been an increase in violent criminals, it's been an increase in nonviolent criminals.
But prison reform isn't something that we can necessarily enact overnight or within 1 year here. And in fact, if we cut correction spending very much, the state risks a federal takeover of our prison system, right?
Right. No, to do this well and to do it in a way that would systematically reduce costs and be fair to everyone, this is something that would require a good decade of reform, and it would require federal and state cooperation.
You also talked about Medicaid. Would there be some options to possibly help stem the growth in Medicaid over time?
Yes, it's a similar story, that this could be a long-term solution, but it would take a long time to enact and make happen, and it will require, again, cooperation of the federal and state governments. So one thing would be to move towards block granting in Medicaid, where you no longer have percentages of services covered, or you basically lose current funding formulas and get to a point where a fixed amount of money is given to the Medicaid system to fund health care for the poor.
And then we also talked about work that our colleague Dan Smith did as part of our Improving Lives in Alabama project on school service privatization. What would be involved there?
So school service privatization is really interesting, because when you look at the numbers, these sound like very small amounts, but they're small amounts that add up. So this includes things like bus service for students in the K through 12 system. It includes things like the dining services, trash pickup, other facilities, maintenance of their facilities, other kinds of expenses related to their facilities. That those services, you can see significant savings, perhaps 10% across the board, and that adds up to many millions of dollars if the more school districts take advantage of those potential savings.
Well, again, it sounds like another thing that's not going to be able to be accomplished overnight, right?
Right, although compared to an overhaul of the Medicaid system or an overhaul of our criminal justice system, this is something that can happen within just a few years. And we've seen that in states like Michigan, where more and more school districts went towards privatizing those services. And from parents and students, the feedback was that service was just as good, if not better, and the cost savings were quite substantial.
So if we have some strategies that we might be able to implement to, over a longer term, reduce spending and reduce it in a wise way, we still face a problem of what do we do to about this general fund gap for the next year or maybe the next couple of years. And so what might be a solution here?
Well, one solution would be to look really hard and consider an emergency measure where you are able to use some of the surplus from the Education Trust Fund, for example, to help shore up the short-term gap in the general fund. But going forward, you want something much more systematic than that. Otherwise, as education expenses grow, or if the state has more need for expenses related to for things that come from the Education Trust Fund, you don't want to continually raid that to shore up the general fund. You do need a more systematic fix going forward.
But I think it is kind of interesting, as you suggest here, that possibly, since a lot of people do, Governor Bentley's mentioned that like just to simply raid the educational trust fund would be a very short-sighted idea. But if it's part of a strategy where we are going to do other things to sensibly bring spending under control long term, that might be a more far-sighted idea, right?
Right. I mean, if that were the bargain that were to take place, right, where for the short term we're going to use these earmarked funds somewhere else to shore up as an emergency measure, but in response for receiving, or in exchange for receiving those emergency funds, if the legislature could make a deal with the governor to then figure out a way to, over the long run, cut spending and make the general fund budget sustainable over the long run.
Well, Steve, thanks very much. This is an enjoyable conversation, and again, welcome to Troy. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.